Yate shikedo shidne she winoki yepa yinashia oge po ge kashte. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Winoka Yepa. I am the Senior Manager of Museum Education at the IAIA Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, located on the ancestral homelands of the Tewa people, known as Oge Pa'oge or White Shell Water Place. Thank you all for taking part in this important conversation on Indigenous curatorial practices. I am very excited to share space with four amazing curators and artists, and just want to thank each of them for sharing their story with us. I would also like to thank the Indigenous Curatorial Collective and the Canadian General Consulate for being a part of this project. It was a pleasure collaborating with both of these organizations on this event. Thank you.
Everyone. My name is Jaclyn Roessel. I am connecting from the lands of the Tamaya people. My partner and I live in my partner's homeland, which is just north of Albuquerque in New Mexico. And I am a cultural justice and equity consultant, have been at times a curator. I come from a museums background. I'm also a poet and a mama, a new mama. I have a almost 3-month-old who I'm like crossing my fingers. Well, I have said enough and we'll be okay for the duration of our conversation. But it's so wonderful to be in connection and conversation with you all.
I'm Patricia Marroquin Norby, and I'm Purepecha, and I want to acknowledge as a Purepecha woman, I'm a guest here in Lenape-Hoking or Lenape homelands, and I'm just very excited to be part of this conversation. Thank you for inviting me.
In my homelands down south in the Chickasaw Nation, and I'm excited to talk to you all.
My name is Dyani Whitehawk. I am a visual artist and independent curator from time to time. I've done curatorial work in the past. Well, just doing a project now too. But I guess I consider myself more specifically, my full-time practice as an artist. And anyways, I'm Sichango Dakota. I'm in Minnesota, so Dakota homelands, but I'm also right now I'm up north in Mille Lacs, so on the Mille Lacs reservation, and right on Mille Lacs Lake for a little bit of a break away from the cities. And I'm happy to be with you guys today.
Hi there, my name is Whess Harman, and I'm just re-recording this after we had a little bit of a glitch with the other recording. So, like I said, my name is Whess, and I am Carrier-Watat from the Lake Babine Nation. I'm currently speaking to you from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and just a little bit about myself. I am currently the curator over at Grant Gallery in so-called Vancouver. I work primarily as an artist and as a curator with a lot of crossover. I've been doing a lot of smaller publishing projects like the Together Apart zine, as well as some upcoming work with Gallery Gachet, and along with my own solo show coming up next year at Open Space. As a curator, mostly I've been working on projects related to Together Apart, but also working with Vanessa Kwan and previously with Glenn Alteen before he retired at Grant Gallery. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the talk. Thank you.
So this panel brings together Indigenous curators and artists based in so-called Canada and the United States, who will discuss issues and movements of solidarity, accountability, respect, and reciprocity in their roles as curators, educators, and artists within the institutions for which they work or collaborate. What does Indigenous curatorial practices mean in terms of curation? How do we take care of ourselves while also supporting the communities we belong to while working with institutions? How can we develop long-term relationships between Indigenous art creatives across the colonial border? So that's the framing for our conversation. It's such a wonderful just gift to be able to share this digital space with you all. And I am so humbled, and I'm really thrilled to be able to jump into this conversation with you all who are just incredible Indigenous curators, creatives, and artists. And I think for our first conversation, I would love to, so many of you have, and you can expand on this, just such expertise, but also I think a real sense of responsibility of stepping into roles for the first time, really holding this place of really not just self for within like your profession and like your vision, but also this place of responsibility for your communities and nations. And so really thinking about just the representation that that you all are really, I guess, navigating. And so what I think about the question that I think is really important to kind of have a conversation about is really the accountability that you all, both institutional accountability and the lack of Indigenous representation in leadership positions within institutions and organizations in so-called Canada and the US. And I'm curious, like, how do you navigate that, or how has that been? I know, for instance, maybe we could start with Patricia. Like, you have stepped into a role at a world-renowned institution that has really carved out a space for the first time ever. And I would love to kind of maybe just begin with that piece of thinking about how you articulate accountability within that scope.
Thank you, Jaclyn. In terms of accountability, my sense of accountability actually it stems from my own personal experience as an Indigenous woman, and my own connections with my own community, but also it's long term. So it's not just something that suddenly popped up in this moment of stepping into this position at the Met. And it's sometimes a challenge for me to answer questions like this because my sense of accountability, number one, has always felt very natural to me. So working with source communities, always looking to the source communities for their perspectives, for their needs, how they would prefer the ancestral items or art items to be presented. So this is something that I've practiced throughout my entire career as a scholar, as an artist, and also as an Indigenous institutional director. I've worked both as a director at the Newberry Library in Chicago with their Indigenous collections, and then also at NMAI as a senior executive and assistant director, and now stepping into the curatorial role. And I've always followed what I felt was right and what I felt was appropriate in working with source communities. And so that's one part of it. But also there's another level for it, about it for me, and that is there was a distinct moment for me in 2016 when working at the Newberry Library. I was one of the keepers of the Popol Vuh, which is a sacred text to the Quiche people in Guatemala. And every 4 years, the Quiche community would come and do a ceremony working with the Popol Vuh and giving a blessing ceremony. And this particular year, the Quiche community came and they asked me to participate in this ceremony. And in that ceremony, I was not only given a protective blessing, but also asked to make to promise to always ensure that the Popol Vuh was available, was protected and available to future generations, Quiche generations, as well as other Indigenous communities. And this particular ceremony had great impact for me because it not only awakened another level of accountability for me in regard to the Popol Vuh, but also to future generations and community and also their access to materials. And so understanding that not every community is the same, and that there are some communities, in particular in this situation, the Quiche people talked about how if the Popol Vuh were ever to leave that particular archive, and go back to Guatemala, that it was likely that that sacred text would be destroyed by the government. And so understanding that tremendous responsibility to Indigenous peoples and what their needs are and how they prefer for people to engage with their items. So there's so much more that I could say, but I want to also hear my colleagues and their experiences.
John, I would love for you to chime in, because I also think that your experience is really unique in that you are a Chickasaw citizen, so you are have moved across the colonial border into real like First Nations territory in Canada, or what we so calledly call Canada, and have stepped into a role for the first time that has really made huge impact in the field, in a country that hasn't seen an Indigenous director. And so I would love for you to kind of give us that perspective too of the transborder experience.
Yeah, the accountability question, I'm sure, could fill up a whole panel or many panels. It's so encompassing. There's the accountability to my nation, to the territory that I'm in, the land and the people here, the usual stakeholders of the institution, which is quite nebulous in and of itself, and to the broader Indigenous arts community. And it's the I guess the headlines and the way my appointment is figured in a way that's, that can be in a headline around the first Indigenous CEO of a major arts institution in Canada. Presenting it as such provides some complications for me because that can be the headline, and then I try to address all of the nuance that's involved in that and the caveats that are required when you're working outside of your territory, and when there's the national government, the federal government, which it's not that medicine line, that border between nations is not that's not our border, but it makes a difference. And there's legal differences, there's cultural differences, and so it's something very real. And although as Chickasaw people, we have migration from the beginning of us being Chickasaw people. It's in our origin story, traveling with Choctaw, and so migration and relationship to land is, especially with the Trail of Tears, is something that is complex to me, and I have but then situated here in pre-Soto Dakota Lakota territory, the homeland of the Métis Nation, in the city where Louis Riel was hung, and the traumas of the founding of Canada that's here, and the accountability that's required to represent that, and then to be so there's an accountability really that any cultural institution has to that, and then it just demands a little bit more and comes with much increased scrutiny that I think I would assume all of us in this panel are used to the extra scrutiny that comes just being Indigenous into these appointments, that while navigating, stepping into this role is something that takes a lot of navigation and scrutiny, but at the same time, to then there's just a lot more placed from all different angles around Indigenous folks entering these institutions, and from just signing release forms so that my nation can verify my citizenship, to reporters here in Canada, to people from who are from international Indigenous nations that are navigating what their commitment or their identity is within a Canadian context, from folks from South America who've chosen to identify as settler because they've settled into this territory, and then saying, well, since you're Chickasaw, are you a settler? Well, not on Turtle Island, I'm not, but I am a guest in this territory, and it's so I think the accountability is expansive, but it also requires a little bit of definition of who you choose that you want to be accountable to. And when I had my first curatorial appointment here in Regina at Neutral Ground, the Artist Run Center here, my adoptive grandmother here in this territory, I met with her because I was fresh out of undergrad. I had this Western education alongside my family one, and I said, what does it mean to be a curator from an Indigenous perspective? And to sit down and have that conversation with people that you trust and respect, and to have that guidance from the local community as well as your own, is something that I think is the highest level of accountability that if I can live up to that one, then I can feel good about the work that I'm doing.
Thank you, John. You've provided just in your conversation so much, added to the nuance and just the richness and complexities that exist in being an Indigenous curator. And I would love for Whess, if you would love to chime in. You are at Grant Gallery, and I would love to just hear about how you think about accountability in the work that you do.
Yeah, for sure. So I think for me, okay, it's very weird to come into a curatorial role for the first time during a pandemic. Just so many of our, what we're doing right now in our programming is so different from what we would normally be doing, in that throughout the pandemic, we've only had 2 exhibitions. Usually we have 4 or 5 each year. But in terms of accountability, so a lot of our work has shifted over to accessibility at the moment as we're moving into digital space. So it's kind of thinking about a wider community accessibility. I think Grant was kind of in a unique position last year when everyone was issuing statements for Black Lives Matter and everything, where it wasn't it was a hard conversation, I think, within the institution and sectorally across the board. But within Grant, yes, we want to continue to work towards representing more Black artists and their work. But in our history of Grant, Indigenous arts has been such a cornerstone of the programming there. So when I came into the position, it was after 3 years of already working in contracts with Grant. So I already had an idea of what they were about, and what it has meant for Indigenous arts in the community. So just trying to follow that line and continue to be that safe place for artists to feel comfortable even submitting their work has kind of been what we're looking at. We have our exhibitions week coming up, so we have outreach just to continue to reach out to the Indigenous artists who were already submitting anyways. So in that way, I feel very lucky in the position that I came into, is that Grunt has already been kind of pegged as an, just a safe place for people to even talk about it. But accountability wise, I think as an artist, like I would definitely consider myself an artist before a curator. A lot of what I try to do with my curatorial practice is not to repeat the mistakes that people made with me as an Indigenous artist in the past. Just being able to work with Indigenous curators as an Indigenous person can mean a world of difference. It just means being able to start from more common ground without having to explain yourself from the ground up. And I think that's what I'm trying to do when I'm working with any artists, but especially the Indigenous artists. I just want to make it as smooth as possible because I know how difficult it is in other institutions sometimes. Yeah, that's all I have for now.
I appreciate that, and I'd love for Dyani for you to chime in and add, because both an independent curator and a visual artist, I think just rounding out some of the conversation so far, and love to hear your thoughts.
Sure thing. I just identify with and understand a lot of what everybody has already spoken to. There are things that I was thinking about as well. And so I guess I'll build off that a little bit. So both when working as an artist and when working as a curator, because in both formats, you have the ability to speak to the public, right? You have the ability to engage with the public. You have a platform, you have a place to speak from, and then the ability to connect folks and make voices heard, and highlight and spotlight and lift up the voices of other artists and bring people together. And as Native people, without a doubt, we have accountability, like layers and layers and layers of accountability that we have to tend to and think about. And I like that, Patricia, that you mentioned that it's inherent in who you are. And that is what I believe that we're going to, I'll try not to jump fully to this other question, but the question of, what is Indigenous curation? It's that, it's thinking through a lens that is guided by a cultural value system. And so the fact that, you're not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a whole nother conversation or a subject for you, because it's inherent in who you are, what you've been taught, your worldviews, your approach to your work is going to be guided by those things, because you've been taught those things, right? And I think that's really important, because, as an artist, anytime I put work out that incorporates Lakota art forms, symbolism, art histories, language, whatever that is, I'm thinking very carefully about what will feel good to my community, and where the boundaries may lie for what I think might be overstepping sharing, or overstepping overstepping just healthy boundaries. We're a communal people. We're taught to be in relationship with one another and supporting and nurturing one another. And so those things have always come into mind, and I'm thinking about that first and foremost. But then I'm also thinking about Native communities at large, and I'm thinking about the field of Native arts at large. How can I best serve the field and the growth of our field? How can I best support other Native artists? How can I make room and space for other Native artists and their views and viewpoints? And then I'm thinking about the local community. And then there's layers within the local community. So there's different circles within the local community. And for me, being in the Twin Cities area, it's a very intertribal area. Any of us that are in, metro areas, we tend to be among pretty intertribal spaces. And so you've got various perspectives and viewpoints within that. And then you also have your art crew and your non-art crew. So you have public and local community that is either embedded in and trained in the arts, or are artists themselves. And then you have your public, your local community that isn't trained in the arts, but will come and participate in our public art spaces are for that, right? So we have to be thinking about how the work best serves them as well. And I know that sometimes we get really caught up in the exciting intellectual academic continuity and back and forth conversation. And at times, sometimes curators can forget that not everybody has that training, and we have to be thinking about folks that are not trained in the arts and how is the work gonna best serve them too. And then I think for myself, I also think it's really important, at least within the way I approach the work, our public spaces are supposed to be for the public at large. So I'm thinking about our Indigenous communities first, because that's how I've been taught. But I've also been taught, at least from a Lakota perspective, to recognize and put deep value and worth in the relatedness to all people and to all life. So how is what we're presenting also going to fill, nurture, educate, connect with, build bridges to, and offer something to non-Native folks and public outside of our communities as well? I think it's important to carry that. And then I also feel, especially recently, but it's been a value it's been there at large, but I feel we are in a unique position because of some of those teachings to also be working towards cross-cultural connections between other BIPOC artists at large. We have teachings that help guide us in that work, and I think that we have the ability to be leaders in that work, or at least, I don't know if leaders needs the right word, strong contributors in that work because of some of those teachings that we have. And to me, when I'm paying attention to that and thinking about that, I'm being accountable to myself and my own value systems.
Yes, everything that you said, Dyani, is just really beautifully. Everyone's heads were nodding. And I think that it's your comments are a perfect kind of starter for this conversation that you began to articulate, or the question you began to answer as you were sharing. Is just like, how does Indigenous curation, how does that differ from kind of the Western model of curation, and what, how have you come to know like each of those practices? So I'm wondering if, John, if you would like to kind of add to some of what Dyani has already kind of articulated.
Yeah, it's I go through different phases in thinking about the difference between Indigenous curation and other forms, and I think there is a very strong difference. But being in institutions that have a certain momentum and identity and spirit to them as well, can deviate you, can push you from that path, or at least create a lot of hurdles. Working as a independent curator, or when I was at smaller institutions, upholding certain principles and working methodologies was a little bit easier. But then when you involve large teams, that requires a shift in working processes and mindsets for many different individuals. And it's a longer, it involves what I've been calling soul work at the institution of work of not just the work that you're doing as an institution, as the cultural institution, but about the individuals who serve that community through their employment there, through their membership, and bringing everyone along with you in that process is required to uphold Indigenous principles, or like of the time and relationship building required, and those long-term commitments, the partnerships that aren't just transactional and about it starts to filter into all things that the institution does, trickle into the way that you look at conservation, of record keeping, of just every aspect. What was just being said too, though, about the responsibility to BIPOC communities, and in I've been afforded a lot of privilege in entering the position that I'm in, and as a guest in this territory, and one where I've been accepted as family, and thinking about the hospitality shown to me, and the responsibility to extend that hospitality as well to others, to Black and POC and refugee who are coming to this territory, and and so I see that as not necessarily a commitment to Indigenous principles and diverse communities, but as a extension of that commitment to the Indigenous principles of this territory, which are built around practices of hospitality, that's a responsibility to share that. And we had a wonderful training session on anti-racism and ancestral accountability by Future Ancestors, organization based here in Canada, that spoke to ancestral accountability in a way that I hadn't thought about it before, because I always think about it, my own ancestors, and but she framed us, everyone has ancestors who they're accountable to, and my ancestors from my mother's side, who I don't really know, she's adopted, but who come from a mixed European background, to think about the accountability for the settlement of this territory. So our white staff and visitors who have to think about what accountabilities they inherit with that privilege of this system, as a parallel in the same system of accountability that we have to our ancestors, that I have to my Chickasaw ancestors, in carrying that culture forward, and continuing to continuing those legacies. And so when thinking about it that way, then it creates space for those accountabilities to both honoring traditions and carrying them forward, and those and the accountabilities created through darker histories, and such as and think, so that allows for that complexity when even my accountability to my Chickasaw ancestors also have a responsibility for the treatment of Black folks in our territory as well, which so I really liked that framework that allows for something that can be understood by all of our staff and our community, and thinking about how they have to all be engaged in that activity.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's very much like this intersectional approach to like thinking about accountability in and of itself. Yeah. Um, I would love for Patricia or Whess if you would love to chime in and add on. I know we're going like one after another, but I also feel like if there's something you want to like are really enthused about addressing, please feel free. Like this can definitely be a conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate everything that my colleagues are sharing here, and of course, you know, relate to so much of what they're saying. And in regards to model of curation, you know, this model of you know, Indigenous curation is, you know, relatively new. I think that that's important to acknowledge here, and has been developing, you know, within the past you know, what, at least within mainstream museums, within the past 20 years or so. So, and I know that there were moments prior to this, of course, but I think that within the larger context, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge how new this practice is in many ways. And so there's this level of navigation for all of us that's occurring right now as we're all talking about. But in my own curatorial practice, it's really grounded in community. And so, and I communicate best when I give examples. So I hope that's okay. But and I want to give an example, but also understanding that the items that I'm working with, always keeping in mind that they're expressions of sovereignty and identity, connections to, you know, kinship represent kinship ties to homelands, intergenerational and ecological knowledge. All of these things are so important to these items. And I really prefer to say items or another word, or you know, maybe ancestral items or art items. The word object is really uncomfortable for me to say. But also understanding that they embody, you know, origin stories, languages, songs, dances, all of these things, and recognizing that, and when it's appropriate, making sure that those moments are foregrounded, whether it's in the texts, you know, in the gallery spaces or on labels, all of these things, because I think it's important, as Dyani was touching on, you know, we have diverse audiences. And so, you know, there is a specific level of, I don't know how to say this, but like catching up other audiences who are just learning and beginning to understand all of this, and really how rich and complex and diverse our communities really are. So presenting that appropriately and respectfully, and also in a way that best presents and represents the items that we're working with. But also when working with individual artists, developing long-term relationships with the communities that I work with, not only the local communities, but you know, beyond the local communities, and then individual artists, developing longer relationships with them, and having that opportunity to talk to artists is so exciting to me. I know it takes a lot of time and effort. People are very busy, you know, all of these things, and doing my best to maintain relationships when I can, and having conversations with artists about how they want for their work to be presented. And so not always presenting oneself as the expert of everything, because it's impossible. Like, we just can't, there's no way that each of us can do that, even though there's this level of expectation from people for us to present ourselves in that way. And one example I have of this is when I first arrived. So I have to say that we just finished our recent installation of the Art of Native America 2022 rotation. So it's the first major rotation of this collection. And I stepped in the middle of the film, in a sense, and onboarded virtually. And so much of that rotation was already curated before my arrival. And so when I stepped in and saw the checklists for all of the items, I had a lot of questions. I felt like there needed to be significant changes. And one of them, for instance, was the opening piece that our museum visitors would see when they would enter the gallery. And they had this really wonderful show-stopping piece planned for that particular space, and it was incredibly beautiful, all of these things. But I said, you know, it's really important that we have a strong local Native representation from what is now the New York region. And I had to keep saying it over and over and over to my colleagues. And it took a little while before people could understand, because it was this sense of being so focused on the aesthetics, so focused that this is such a show-stopping piece. Like, why do we need anything else? Why? And I had to, you know, say, like, this is in regard to Indigenous protocol, and it's important for us to acknowledge the local communities first. And so these kinds of moments, even though they might not seem big to us, they are significant, they're important. And I'm glad that I, you know, was able to push for that, and also engage in conversations with the local communities and also local artists to more strongly represent them within the gallery space. But also one of the things that Dyani brought up, and also Whess, that I'm very appreciative of, is the idea of and practice of intercultural conversations with the artwork and art items within the gallery space. You know, as a Purepecha woman, my mother's community is from south of the US-Mexico border, and I'm an Indigenous woman, and I'm a guest in Lenapehoking, and my community is often left out of the conversations. So much of these conversations only focus on the US and Canada. And then we're south of the border, and even along the border, Indigenous people we're completely left out. And so it's incredibly painful for me to have to say that again and again and again in the context of these types of conversations, because we're often not acknowledged. And so that's another level of accountability that I have. And it's also something that I think that as Indigenous communities here in US and Canada, it's another layer that we ourselves have to begin practicing more and learning about and opening up to, right? Because I think that we're still not at that place. We're not at that level yet. And I think I'd like to see us begin to go in that direction.
Thank you,
Can I
Patricia,
respond
for
just-
that, Colin? Yeah, absolutely, Dyani.
Just real quick, I just want to say I'm so glad you brought that up, Patricia, because I was thinking about how beautiful it was that both John and you, Patricia, are part of this panel because of that exact same reason. We understand that those borders are imposed, and what John said earlier about there are real complexities at times. If you're speaking about, like, if your project has federal dollars and you're only able to do this, or sometimes if your project has regional dollars and you're only able to do this, there's times when the institutional workings are the prohibitive that put up the boundaries that allow us to, maybe not work as freely as we want to. But there's other times that those obstacles aren't there. But I think that we have gotten so used to, like, that, that this space is this space and this space is this space. Even if we don't believe it, it's still soaked in, and we've still grown accustomed to, and then we're most comfortable in this space. We're most comfortable in this. I know this place best. I know this place best. I don't quite know how to figure that out or work with that, or I don't know the people there as well. But I think the only way that that's going to be resolved is if we are actively working towards acknowledging it, not only in speech, but in our actions too, right? And so I think that, it's really important. We have to find that balance, right, between recognizing the inherent knowledge that comes with local folks and work from the local community and connection to the local community and Indigenous communities in that space, but also that we have the ability to contribute to one another across, the imposed borders. And if we're going to be talking about the imposed borders, how are we putting into action that we want to break down, the obstacles that are presented by those borders that are sometimes in our minds.
Yeah, I think that we can talk about the incredible violence of immigration policies and what those borders have created, and the rhetoric around people sometimes who are indigenous to a territory are called illegal in that very space, but without reaching across or creating without living a different model for relating. And I think that we can't really work against that. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Patricia.
Whess, would you like to chime in or have any thoughts to share?
Kind of lost track of where the start of this little round of conversation began. But yeah, echoing the same thoughts, just thinking about borders, and Vancouver is such a, yeah, we work with a lot of different communities. Like weirdly in Vancouver, there's no Indigenous run art center. Grunt's kind of been the closest thing, to the point where sometimes people assume that we are an Indigenous run art center, especially now with me in the curator position. But there are so many other groups that have been organizing for so many years that we're really integrated in working with other artist run centers in town who maybe focus more on I'm thinking mostly of Chinatown. So there's 221A there and Center A as well. And then more recently, we also have, ironically, someone who moved here from Toronto and then just has been amazing. Naya Lewis is this Black curator who started her own organization called Black Art Gastown that showcases Black artists within the area and around Hogan's Alley, which is historically a Black community in Vancouver. So at Grunt, my focus is always going to naturally be Indigenous art and artists first, but we're just so interconnected here. It's almost like impossible to not think about more of these cultural connections. And I think that was the thing, being able to come into a curator position that is not specifically an Indigenous curator position was the thing that I was most excited about, because that's already how I've been working as an artist as well. So, yeah.
And it's so important for the world to see that Native folks can be in positions that aren't specific to just Native art, so I'm happy for that.
Yeah, everything at Grunt's very low key. We're very organic in the way we operate, which is to say chaotic. But once the announcement went up for my position, it kind of, I don't know if I was just like naive about it, but once it went up, I was like, oh yeah, this does look like a big deal. Like there's, visibly racialized, not white passing person taking this position who's also trans, who's also queer, like all of these things. I was like, oh man, I do tick off a lot of those boxes. And the response was so, I had to turn my phone off for a few days because I was just like, there's a lot of congratulations and celebratoriness, but also a lot of like, wow, I can't wait to see what you're doing. And Grunt is we do an open call for our submissions. So in terms of curatorial practices, I'm not in particular developing my own shows and ideas. It's more like, I kind of look at myself as more the point of contact for someone coming in and making sure they have a good and smooth experience. But yeah, the pressure is on.
Appreciate you just sharing that like celebration and the milestone and just the way that you face that, Whess. It's yeah, it is a big deal. And I think it also kind of ties into what I think, you know, in terms of time can be like our last question as we think about really like care. So much of what you all talked about, like I think times turns is woven into this idea of like solidarity, like is an extension of care, and like the curation and the approaches that like you all use in your work as both curators and artists, like is something that is very intentional. It is something that is approached like with care in that facing toward like accountability, but whether that's inward and also like forward, whether we're talking about within communities or within like future descendants, right? And so I think this last question really is, you know, how can we build relationships and expand our relations with Indigenous art creatives like across Turtle Island? So thinking of this kind of longer vision of impact that you all have and how you envision that moving forward. So whoever wants to chime in first, I will actually defer to you all.
I'll go first because I feel like you guys are going to have more concrete answers. I read that question and I was like, oh man, I don't want to pretend to have the answer for that because I don't. But I still feel stumped by it. That thing that we're talking about, that like impose, you know, that the mental border is there in a real way. And part of that is because of the lack of communication, the lack of collaboration, and the lack of education about one another across those spaces. And then even the lack of ability to like freely move across those spaces and be in relationship with folks across those spaces. Like, it kind of blows my mind that there's so many Ocheti Shakoi people in Canada and I don't know them. Like I can't, where here I can be like, oh, I know this person on this road, this person on that, you know, like that. It's the interconnectivity is easy here because of the ability to, you know, easily physically move across space and visit and be with one another, right? So, but I do think that we can even, you know, make small gestures even on how to kind of proactively work against that and proactively build in ways that hopefully, you know, would, I guess, just contribute to momentum. So I'm with Patricia in the fact that I also work well when speaking about examples. And so I just have two tiny examples. When I was curating the All My Relations Gallery in Minneapolis, I had such a profound realization, and I can't even remember the source of it, but I just was thinking about this topic. I'm like, the division between, and Patricia, this is an example what you were talking about before too, but you know, at the time I thought was the division between Canadian First Nations artists and curators and artists and curators in the States is pretty tremendous and easy to see. And you know, at the time I wasn't even thinking of you know, Indigenous communities and curators south of the border, but I was thinking about folks in that direction. And I was looking at more and more First Nations artists and really just, you know, taking it upon myself to educate myself on some of these folks and be so impressed with so many of their practices. And I remember having this moment where I was like, man, people stateside have a lot to learn from some of these artists up there because they are killing game. Like it was, there are so many phenomenal artists and I had to take it upon myself to find them, you know? And so I was like, what does that mean? You know, if I went to tribal colleges, went to Haskell and I went to IAIA, and IAIA definitely does, for those who listen to this and don't know the acronym, Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico is a tribal college, an arts tribal college. And there's a good amount of education on Indigenous art at large across our entire continent, across Turtle Island. It's done well, but it could be even more specific in the approach, where we're intentionally crossing those mental borders and intentionally addressing that conversation, and intentionally breaking it down and intentionally building connections. And so when I was at the All My Relations Gallery and I was thinking through this, and I wanted to curate a show that recognized that. And so I just hit up my friend, Sherry Farrell-Rossett, and was like, Sherry, can you just, I don't know, build me a list of folks you admire or folks that you are thinking about or think that we should be thinking about, or and she did that for me, and that was a huge source of an important source of research content for me to be able to, so just even as simple as like reaching out to a friend and saying, tell me who I should be thinking about, and so I curated a solo exhibition for Rosalie Favell at the All My Relations Gallery, and it was awesome, and she's so sweet, and we have a good relationship now. And but that was a small gesture on my part to just reach out to somebody I know who knows the area and be like, I need to know more. What can you offer me? What can you help me with? So taking that research on yourself, and then I just want to say there's a lot of those restrictions that I mentioned before that come with funding. But there are places who don't pay attention to that, right? And I think that the Eiteljorg Fellowship is a good example of folks that aren't willing to play that game and are, bringing in Indigenous artists, at least across the U.S.-Canadian border. I don't know that they've ever had a South American Indigenous person, but we should hit them up and ask them about it if they haven't. So, that's, if they're willing to go in that direction, perhaps, that's a resource to at least start building South as well, But I think that more, a model like that is a model that more people can employ, and we should be actively promoting that when we sit in circles and in community with people that have resources to provide opportunities.
Thank you, Dyani.
I hope it's okay if I respond to Dyani's comments. And I appreciate so much of what you have to say. And I agree, and also think that there are ways also within the gallery spaces that we can address these issues of solidarity and build solidarity. So for instance, I was recently thinking about and working on an idea for quill work, because it's regional to the northeast of where we're located at the Met, and also further north, obviously. And as I was going through collections, which is one of the most exciting things for me, I started to realize there were all these interconnections of the quill work, but also feather work with Indigenous communities further south. And you start looking at the collections in this way, you start realizing all of these interconnections materially with the items that you're working with. And there's all these intercultural exchanges happening, conversations going on, materials that definitely reached across, all the imposed borders. And so I like to think about that as well, like how we can actually tangibly exercise within our gallery spaces those moments of solidarity across Indigenous communities, And because it's one thing for us to have conversations about all of this, and I always appreciate these discussions, talking about what we would like to do or what we're aspiring to or what we're practicing, but then to actually be able to demonstrate that and show that, as Dyani was talking about, I feel like that has a huge impact. And I would like to see more of that.
That makes me really excited. I just want to keep talking about that topic.
I've been thinking just in terms of going forwards and kind of, yeah, I haven't had a lot of time to really like be a curator, I feel like, or to really think about what that means for me in a lot of ways. But just thinking back to last year, during the Wet'suwet'en solidarity blockades, for a solid like month, that just became my life. I was working at Grunt on contract, and I came into work one day to get ready for some book fair or something, but I was so upset just because the Wet'suwet'en are the neighboring territory to my nation. So a lot of the people who have been up at Unistoten are people who took care of me when I was growing up. And I just have, you know, really strong feelings about the land there. And throughout the blockades, like the one thing that I felt like was really helping hold me together and taking care of me was the arts community, and just the sheer amount of like how we kind of developed our own Two-Spirit Indigiqueer kind of cohort that was able to move through these spaces more safely. Because the reality is, like a lot of Indigenous movements, it's not the safest place for Two-Spirit folks, especially trans women. And so being able to move in that way was really important. But we also had alliances with people attached to other artist-run centers. And I think the way I kind of think about curation a little bit is kind of keeping these connections when we aren't in times of crisis, and like helping build those connections with each other. So when the crisis does come up, that we already have kind of a built-in understanding of one another. Yeah, it just, that was such an important experience for me. And Grunt was just so generous. Like I came into work and like, as I was pulling those books together for the book fair, like started crying, which I've never really done at work before. So that in itself was alarming for my coworkers, but they understood already what was going on. And like, I'm the only Indigenous person at my work, but everyone was like, I think you need to go be with, you know, the people that you care about right now. And they let me go. And for that chunk of time, they really viewed that work as a part of being a curator and an artist and being connected to community. A lot of the meetings and like emails that I was involved with at the time, everyone was at the blockades anyways. So it was kind of like, yeah, I'll just, no, they're not going to answer an email. So it makes more sense to be here anyways. But then thinking of that in like a broader context, just with alliances with, like what I really dream of is more cross-cultural alliances in general, just to dismantle white supremacy. Like we really need to band together. And I think right now, what can be really disheartening in moments is kind of the arguments and things that we have internally with each other. And I'm just like, but imagine how strong we could be. Yeah, I'll finish that half big thought there.
I've been thinking about care recently and its relationship to action. There's one of my favorite recent pieces of artwork made is Amy Malbuff's Jimmy Durham 1974-2014, which she takes a quote the Jimmy Durham quote that says, an Indian who sits and does beadwork or conducts beadwork classes or trades beadwork when he or she should be on the front lines with a gun or organizing his or her community is performing a counter-revolutionary act. And what does she do with that quote? The only thing that she could do, she beads it on a tarp, and it's this beautiful, subtle resistance to that to that the sentiment that violence is the only way, and thinking through that and what is revolutionary, and where are our paths towards revolution, and I think so. So when I first encountered that, I was really grateful to have this beautiful poetic way of articulating these softer forms of resistance that were situated in care, and that's maybe because maybe I'm a softer person too, and I was thinking through, and I really admire a lot of people who've created the space that like I wouldn't have the opportunities I have without people kicking down doors and and really like our warriors that made that space. And there's a tension that exists sometimes. Maybe it's cyclical, but it's something that's being felt now, that there's some of the fights that we're engaged in, that there's sometimes, I think there needs to be that balance between the warriors and those offering care, that those need to exist in harmony. And some people, some very powerful people, can have both embedded into them, and sometimes it's people have different roles that they're playing, and it's I heard a really I was talking to Crystal Mowry, the senior curator at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery recently, and she was talking about her work with Deanna Bowen, a solo exhibition she's presenting, and Deanna's articulated this before about the difference as a Black artist working with a Black curator for the first time, and how different that relationship was. And then hearing Crystal later talking about the process that she undertook, and Deanna was doing a very thorough digging into the history of the gallery there, and also the city, and the city's history as New Berlin, and the white supremacist histories embedded there, and into some of the individuals who founded the gallery and were foundational to the arts movement there, and just talking about the process, the commitment you have in those types of things. Because Deanna's a warrior, and Crystal was there just doing human check-ins. Like, this is about just addressing each other's as humans and saying, what is it? How are you doing? Are you okay? What's it like to sit embedded in these white supremacist histories and be processing that daily in the same location that where they're speaking of, and just those type of those types of very simple but just human gestures, which often we don't really have in our exhibition critical paths. How we're planning our shows, and it's just one example, and there's there's plenty I could bring up, but that one's just remaining freshest in my mind right now. Finding that what that role of that, well, I guess cares in the word of curation, the Latin, which maybe not all of us identify with, and the way that cares define theirs may be a little bit different, but yeah, really honoring that as a role that we can play in our communities.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much for just sharing just what the possibility is for curation to really be that form of care, and so many of you are living into that practice. But what a lot of the things that I heard and like are speaking with me right now is the ability to break down the colonial borders, right? Both within, we think about between like governments, so the man-made ones, but also the ones that are that have been pressed upon us and are in our mind, and the way that that there is so much possibility if we're able to deconstruct those within our mind to relate to each other better, right? And weaving that together with this idea from John of like the opportunity and the gift that it is to stay soft, right? That in and of itself, like to stay soft, like in our work, allows us to be able to relate and to stay open in our practices to each other, whether that's through curation or art. And so much richness like in that, really like both dreaming like into what care can be from a solidarity perspective, and how even in curation, it can be an act of solidarity. Both in group and, you know, from this intersectional like lens and frame, and how there's so much also work to do. So kind of calling in that perspective of Whess, and really noting like there are also a lot of ways that as Indigenous communities we can call upon each other to show up for our trans and two-spirited like relatives, to really help our communities be safer. So there's so much richness, and I know those watching will gather that, gather your wisdom like in this conversation. I just want to thank you all so much for making time to connect with each other from across the colonial cyberspace scape that we're in now. And yeah, just thank you all so much. Ashahat.
Yakuka, thank you.
IAIA.
Yeah, thank you, Masicho. And John, there's so many soft warriors that show up on the front lines who do the most incredible things. I think sometimes right now in this world, the hardest thing is just to choose to stand in a difficult spot. And sometimes that's enough, and you don't need a damn gun to do it. So
Yeah,